Nikita Khrushchev was born on April 15th, 1894, in the small Russian village of Kalinovka. He would die decades later on September 11th, 1971, in Moscow after living through one of the most turbulent eras in modern history. His life, stretching from 1894 to 1971, mirrors the story of a nation in upheaval: the fall of the monarchy, the birth of the Soviet state, the Russian Civil War, the trauma of famine, rapid industrialization, and 2 world wars. Khrushchev's family roots were humble. His grandfather had been a serf forced into military service. His father, a coal miner, worked long days with little education and few opportunities. When the family moved to Yuzovka, which is now Donetsk, Ukraine, Khrushchev began working as a metal worker at age 15. That job exempted him from conscription during World War I, but it has also pulled him into the world of labor politics. In 1914, he married for the first time, but tragedy struck. His wife died in 1919 during a devastating famine, leaving him with 2 young children. He later met Nina Khrushcheva in 1922. They built their life together over decades, raised 3 more children, and only officially married in 1965. Khrushchev received only a basic village education before leaving school to work. After serving in the Red Army in 1919, he was demobilized and admitted to a Soviet workers' school in Yuzovka, where he earned a secondary education and received party training. Despite his rise to the heights of global politics, this was nearly the full extent of his formal schooling. His political ascent began early. Khrushchev joined the Russian Communist Party in 1918 and by 1925 became a district party secretary. Over the next decade, he climbed steadily through the ranks of the Soviet political machine. In 1938, he became the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, a position he would hold twice. Later, he would take on 2 of the most powerful positions in the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev's rise to national leadership began in earnest when Joseph Stalin died in 1953. As head of the Communist Party in Moscow, Khrushchev watched Stalin's designated successor, Georgy Malenkov, miscalculate politically and fall from favor. Sensing the shift, Khrushchev maneuvered strategically, gathering incriminating evidence, winning loyalty within the Central Committee, and ultimately ousting Malenkov after a brief but decisive struggle. Around the same time, the truth about Stalin's atrocities began to surface. Khrushchev made a bold choice to reveal them. In 1956, he delivered his now famous secret speech to Soviet Congress members. Though initially intended to circulate discreetly, its content spread quickly, denouncing Stalin's crimes, igniting unrest, and shaking the Soviet world. Khrushchev sought to remove what he called the stain of Stalinism, hoping to rebuild loyalty to the party. The political effects were not immediate, but they were seismic. By 1958, Khrushchev had consolidated power. Unlike Stalin, he did not rule with absolute authority, but he now stood at the center of Soviet leadership during some of the Cold War's most defining moments. His achievements were varied and ambitious. Khrushchev pursued liberalization, political reform, agricultural innovation, educational restructuring, and a new foreign policy approach. His denunciation of Stalin's brutality led to the release of millions of political prisoners and restored autonomy to countless others. Censorship was relaxed. Soviet literature and arts saw new life. Housing projects expanded. Agricultural reforms, though uneven, aimed to increase productivity. Educational institutions evolved to emphasize technical and industrial development. And under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union soared into the space race, launching Sputnik, the world's first satellite. He even promoted freer travel and cooperation with foreign nations, attempting, however imperfectly, to reduce the risk of war. These achievements were not always durable, but they laid groundwork for Russia's future reforms. Yet Khrushchev's legacy is equally defined by failure and controversy. Many of his policies contradicted or undermined his own reforms. Nowhere was this more evident than in his handling of international relations. He attempted to resolve tensions in Berlin after World War II, but instead helped plunge the region into a deeper crisis, culminating in the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. His efforts to reshape the Soviet military by replacing conventional forces with missiles intensified Cold War fears rather than reducing them. And then came 1962. The world remembers it as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Soviet Union, it was called the Caribbean Crisis. Khrushchev secretly attempted to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, believing this would protect the island and balance U.S. power. But when the United States discovered the operation, the globe edged to the brink of nuclear war. Khrushchev ultimately agreed to withdraw the missiles, yet not all terms of the agreement were made public at the request of the United States, leaving the Soviet people with the perception of defeat. The damage to his political standing was severe. Less than 2 years later, he was removed from power. Nikita Khrushchev's life was a story of contradictions, a man of peasant origins who rose to the helm of a superpower, a reformer who unleashed hope and instability, a Cold War leader who sought peace yet fueled tension. His achievements reshaped the Soviet Union, and his failures reshaped the world.
The years before and directly leading up to Nikita Khrushchev's being in power were full of turmoil and tension. Famine, revolution, and years of control and isolation completely changed the inner workings of the Soviet Union and positive external relationships that had almost completely dissolved. Khrushchev was determined to build relationships with other countries, especially powers like the US and China. But he had no point of reference after the years of isolation that had existed under Stalin's policies. Not only that, but the USSR was dealing with widespread poverty and other conditions that Khrushchev did not have the knowledge to properly deal with. And without allies, there was no help from the others. It wasn't only the USSR that was causing tensions. Many world powers were still at odds with each other over the conclusion of both World War I and World War II and their after effects. Even though the effects of communism and Soviet collectivism did not always bring the best results for the majority of the population, these were the values that were upheld by the leaders and lived by the people. Those in power wanted to spread communism fully through the USSR and the rest of the world. This created tension, as many of the non-communist countries saw this as a threat. Khrushchev is well remembered for the quote, "We will bury you," which he was using as a statement about peaceful coexistence, but only after communism inevitably replaced capitalism. One of the most widespread social norms in the Soviet Union was conformity. People conformed to their government, and the rest of the world needed to conform as well. Khrushchev even struggled to reach true truce with China, one of the largest communist powers at the time, since their methods of instilling it were so different. The structure of the Soviet government was constantly shifting, and one had to take advantage to keep and gain power. Khrushchev gained as much power as he did by exposing his predecessors and ousting his fellows, creating a more positive image of himself in the public's mind by comparison. So he came into power by leveraging himself into what the greater population wanted, and into the kind of person the officials did not want to rally against. His goals did generally have the interests of the people in mind, but they were not executed well. They were ready to be part of the outside world after Stalin, and in desperate need of a stable economy. Unfortunately, Khrushchev wasn't able to stabilize the economy or disperse growing tensions with other countries, but he tried. He did not have the support from others necessary to develop good plans, seeing as Soviet politics were a revolving door of people in power, each with their own ideas. One of Khrushchev's main values and motivations was peaceful coexistence with other countries, but also with the Soviet Union, aligning with some of Kitter's universal human values. He strived for unity within the nation and positive relationships with external forces, motivated by a need for achievement and connection. He did this both by trying to adapt the Soviet Union to keep up with the changing and largely Western world, but also by trying to force the hands of other nations to align with his vision and preferred actions. He sometimes appears to be driven by a socialized need for power, seeking a kind of power that is supposed to serve his country and empower the people in it. But the way he executes it screams for personalized power, impulsive and irrational. Khrushchev was also known for having a very contradictory personality. He was impulsive and emotionally volatile, while also being intelligent and bold. The level of neuroticism that he embodied impacted every other aspect of his power and his connections with other leaders. While he was also agreeable enough to form ties with allies, his impulsivity led to the plenty of tensions with others, both world leaders and those close to him. Khrushchev did not have the cognitive ability to be a leader. He had plenty of technical skills in certain areas he oversaw, such as metalworking, and the conceptual skill to go with that. However, cognitive ability necessitates a certain level of emotional stability to see its full potential. Even with his intelligence, Khrushchev made too many decisions that followed his impulsivity, and that is why many failed. He failed to listen to the truth of the skills he and others possessed. Khrushchev's power base was largely legitimate. He was constantly being elected to new positions, beginning in the 1920s. With each new position, he gained new types of power and influence. He was assigned to different tasks overseas, and he was able to influence his fellow leaders and gain new positions by using other power bases. He came into power after Stalin due to the use of information to essentially blackmail his predecessor, and he helped diminish Stalin by spreading information about his actions after his death. Due to the high rank he received and achieved, he was definitely in possession of all the other power bases to some extent, and due to the nature of communism and the Soviet government. But the referent and informational power bases are the ones he actively played into. The followers of Khrushchev can be categorized into two groups: the people and the powerful. There is a general public and those that were officials alongside him, and each had their own motivations. Considering Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the people were in need of physiological needs and security. They were in and out of shifting poverty and political unrest. They were motivated by making sure they and their families would survive, but many were also motivated and inspired by communism. Even with the unrest that occurred, the idea of it offered security and community. Those in power, especially those like Khrushchev, were motivated by gaining and keeping power wherever they could. In an unstable system, they sought out stable positions and relationships, and needed the respect of others to keep their status. The public, as a group of followers, would likely not be considered independent if using Kelly's 5 followership styles. They would be considered passive or conformist followers. Communism and the Soviet Union did not allow for independent thinking, as there were consequences for speaking out. Some of these followers had passive behavior, and those that would live their lives according to the rules laid out in front of them. Some took more active roles and sought out membership in the Communist Party. Some could likely even be labeled as pragmatic survivors. The more critical thinking these followers would be capable of would still lead them to be wary of consequences. Khrushchev's fellows in power, those that also manipulated the political world to keep their station, would have to be labeled as active in their behavior. Some were absolutely conformists, conforming to Khrushchev's ideas to keep their position, while some would be effective and willing to push back critically, though just as likely for their own personal gain rather than the betterment of society. The engagement levels of Khrushchev's followers is all over the place, as he was not one to create the cult of personality, nor did he have large groups seeking his downfall at all times. many of the public would be considered participant or activist followers, according to Kellerman's follower model. Those in power are harder to put in a box, as the hunger for the power that many possess kept them from being true followers.
When it comes to comparison of context, connections can be found to quite a few of the leaders studied, but especially Ellen Johnson Sirleaf or Mao Zedong. Sirleaf, Mao, and Khrushchev all were born into times of great political unrest and systems that were working against the people that lived in them. The systems were built on corruption, and power was constantly changing hands as leaders came in and out. All three countries were also not doing well economically and had been struggling for decades. The comparison between Mao and Khrushchev is especially strong in this area. China and the Soviet Union both had structures that led to the lower classes being incredibly poor and in need of a lot more resources than they had access to. Khrushchev and Mao both saw the proper implementation of communism as the answer to this class disparity and, as they rose in power, started many initiatives to see this implementation through. In the case of leadership, Nikita Khrushchev is also most easily compared to Mao Zedong. They possessed many of the same traits, both being intelligent, determined, and strategic. Mao and Khrushchev both worked hard to improve international relations and also the lives of the lower classes in China and the Soviet Union respectively, as they valued unity and peace. Mao and Khrushchev even failed similarly. While they both had grand ideas that they worked hard to implement, they were often rash, harsh, or even impulsive in the actual implementation. Certain aspects of their governments and countries needed to be improved, and they were not the ones to do this. The improvement and stabilization of the economy is a major example of this. As Khrushchev and Mao got further in their tenure as leaders, they relied less and less on any form of power base that wasn't legitimate power, as their mistakes began to pile up. There was a shift in both from socialized to personal power. However, Mao and Khrushchev were both leaders that were the right people at the right time to help establish a base for success for their nations. The changes that they implemented and started changed China and the Soviet Union forever. All of the leaders that have been studied this semester, to some extent, have had very passionate and active followers who cared a lot about their respective leaders. While Khrushchev does have followers that were active and cared about his work, he is not known for his followers, and they were generally a lot more passive. The most similarities between his followers and the followers of other leaders is with the followers of Mao Zedong, but the followers he possessed later on after the Great Leap Forward. This is in the sense that the leader began to make worse decisions that the followers had objections to, but the followers did not have enough power or voice to get through to the leader and stop them. A leadership lesson learned from studying Khrushchev is to make changes. A leader cannot be a true leader if they are simply operating under the arrangements made by previous leaders. Even if the changes don't last, they are what a leader will be remembered for. It is also the best indicator of what they cared about, for future generations to study. Another lesson that Khrushchev's time in power made clear is the importance of emotional stability and the lack of impulsivity in a leader. Khrushchev made a lot of decisions that had the intentions of bettering the lives of the people, in his mind. However, he was too impulsive and neurotic to listen to experts and take the time to fully understand and develop a plan. This is what led to the failure of the majority of plans he was able to implement, whether it failed immediately or over the course of decades. Khrushchev's removal began in March of 1964 and was completed in October of that same year. On October 14, 1964, the Central Committee voted to accept his voluntary retirement request for reasons of advanced age and ill health. His position as first secretary was succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev, and he was succeeded as premier by Alexei Kosygin. Khrushchev died of a heart attack at the age of 77 in 1971. His death was not announced until the hour of his wake, and he was denied a state funeral. Even if his reforms didn't last, Nikita Khrushchev is still considered to be one of the better Russian leaders in the 20th century, a forerunner of restructuring and openness.